Our speaker for tonight, Professor Nancy Pearcey, one of the most foremost voices in the evangelical world. We are grateful to God for her many publications, how she has helped us to think wisely and Christianly about life and the world, how to frame our approach to education and to our Christian service in the light of a Christian worldview. And we are grateful for her courage to address key cultural issues of our day. She's a graduate of Iowa State University, holds a master's degree from Covenant Theological Seminary. She served as the Francis Schaeffer Scholar at the World Journalism Institute. Currently, she serves as Scholar in Residence and holds the Gibson Chair of Apologetics at Houston Christian University. Her writings are prolific, and you can choose your favorite title. Mine would be Total Truth, but you may have one that you prefer otherwise. Out on the table tonight, at the end of the session, there are several copies, not a lot, but enough, for Love Thy Body, and that will be associated with her talk tonight. And Professor Pearcey will be available to sign your book at the end of the session, so you might want to make sure you do that before you rush out this evening. But we are delighted that she could come and be with us. I know this is going to be a stimulating presentation, so join me, please, in welcoming Nancy Pearcey to the IACE podium.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the introduction. I don't think anyone ever has memorized the introduction before. That was great. So I've been asked to give a worldview approach to issues covered in my book, Love Thy Body, things like abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, and so on. We tend to address these issues one by one, but we'll be much more effective if we identify the underlying secular worldview that drives all of them. And I'm going to start with just a few examples. I read an interview with a 14-year-old girl who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years, from age 11, and then had recovered her identity as a girl. And she said, the turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body. And this was on a very secular website. So even secular people are coming to see that the worldview that drives the transgender ideology is a negative view of the body. You will see phrases like body hatred. A BBC video features a young woman who identifies as non-binary, telling teenagers, it doesn't matter what living meat skeleton you've been born in, it's what you feel that defines you. So your body has been demoted to a meat skeleton. A BBC documentary called Transgender Kids says at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And who wins that war? The mind does. And then on the academic level, a Princeton University professor wrote a book defending transgender ideology. And she starts out admitting that it involves a disconnect between mind and body, disjunction, self-division, self-estrangement. But then she says this disassociation is not a bad thing. She says it's not pathological because what the real body tells us is nothing. It has no meaning at all. So this is the core of what schools are teaching on people today, down to kindergarten, that their bodies have no meaning at all. Where did such a low view of the body come from, and how can we respond as Christians? Well, it grew out of a secular view of truth. Throughout history, most civilizations have recognized that reality consists of a natural order and a moral/spiritual order. And they thought that they were unified into an integrated cosmos. And therefore, truth about the world would also be an integrated, internally consistent, unified whole. But after the rise of modern science, many people began to say, well, no, the only reliable knowledge we have is science, what we can see, hear, weigh, and measure, empirically testable facts. Well, what does that imply for spiritual and moral truths? They can't be stuffed into a test tube or studied under a microscope. So many people began to say they don't really qualify as truths. They're merely matters of personal feeling and preferences. So the concept of truth has been split, and philosophers often use the metaphor of two stories in a building. In the lower story is science, which is thought to be objectively true, testable, public truth. Things like morality and theology have been tossed into the upper story, where they're treated as private, subjective, and relativistic. This is where we hear people say, that could be true for you, but not for me. The photo there is Francis Schaeffer, and he was the first person to explain to an evangelical audience how the concept of truth had been divided. In secular academia, this is called fact-value split. Do you see the parallels? And Francis Schaeffer didn't actually use the phrase fact value, but I drew the connection in my book, Total Truth, and people began to say, oh, that's what he meant by the upper-lower story divide. And if your concept of truth is divided, that affects everything, including your view of the human person. So we're going to dip into this dualism of the mind, the person-body dualism. It goes all the way back to René Descartes, who's often considered the first modern philosopher. Descartes said nature is a vast machine, and our bodies are little machines running by the inexorable laws of nature. But the mind is free and autonomous. So we can use the laws of nature to control it, as he put it, to be the masters and possessors of nature. Here's how one philosopher explains it. Since Descartes in the 17th century, we've had a vision of the self as a sort of immaterial ghost that owns and controls a body the way you own and control your car. His famous phrase, I think, therefore I am, locates human identity strictly in the mind, in our self-consciousness. This Cartesian dualism has been mocked as the ghost in the machine, but it still shapes secular thinking. A former lesbian who is now Catholic writes, our culture pressures us to think your body is not you. It's just a shell or a juicy robot that the real you, the disembodied ghost, controls. The next key turning point was Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. He went so far as to say our knowledge of nature is a construction of the human mind. That's startling. He writes, objects have no independent existence outside of our thoughts. The mind is the lawgiver to nature. In other words, the human mind creates the order that we think we find in nature. The implication is that we do not take our identity from our body, from our biology. Instead, the mind imposes identity on the body. It's a mental construction. Philosophers call this Kant's nature-freedom dichotomy. But these ideas would not really have taken root without the impact of Darwinism in the 19th century. The key elements of Darwin's theory, random mutations and the blind automatic process of natural selection, were specifically intended to eliminate the concept of design and purpose in nature. So intellectual historian, this is a little temperamental. So the intellectual historian Jacques Barzun says, this denial of purpose is Darwin's distinctive contention. Other forms of evolution may have allowed for some divine guidance, but not Darwin's theory. Or another historian puts it this way, where most men and women generally believed in some kind of design in nature, some kind of plan and order, Darwin wanted them to see all life as empty of any divine purpose. Now, the next step is really the important one. If nature has no purpose, no teleology, then it provides no basis for morality. Here's how one philosopher unpacks the logic. It's interesting that he's not a Christian, but he says, when nature was seen as a manifestation of God's will, the goal of knowledge was to fulfill God's design and live in harmony with his purposes. But if nature does not reveal God's will, then it is a morally neutral realm where humans are free to impose their will. It's merely raw material to be manipulated and controlled to serve human needs and preferences. So he concludes, nature has become a mechanistic system of extended matter without religious or moral significance. And our knowledge of this disenchanted world no longer provides support for either morality or religion. And here's how a Christian professor summarizes it. As Western culture lost belief in the spiritual and ethical significance of creation and the human body, these became essentially amoral mechanisms to be used for whatever private ends or purposes we may have. So what I want you to see is there is a causal connection. It's because of a modernist view of nature and the body as amoral mechanisms that people became postmodern in their view of personal identity, things like gender and sexual orientation. I'll give you a real-life example. There's an outspoken lesbian named Camille Paglia. Are some of you familiar with Camille Paglia? So I usually get more hands. Okay. All right, good. Yes, a lot of Christians read her work because she's a bit of an iconoclastic feminist. But she insists, she insists that nature made us male and female. Our sexual bodies are designed for reproduction. Did you catch that word, designed? Strange word for an atheist. But if nature made us male and female, how does she justify living as a lesbian? By the way, for those of you who've read her, she now identifies as transgender. For the past year or so, she said she's really transgender. But either way, if nature designed us as male and female, how does she justify being gay or trans? Her answer is, why not define nature? After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. Do you catch the logic? If our bodies are products of mindless, purposeless forces, then they have no intrinsic purpose that we are morally obligated to respect. They give us no moral message. They give us no clue to identity. We may do with them as we see fit. So how should Christians respond? Well, for starters, we can show that science is on our side. It's evident to observation that living things are structured for a purpose. On a very basic level, eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing, wings are for flying, fins are for swimming, and the development of the entire organism is directed by an inbuilt genetic plan or blueprint, DNA. So science itself tells us that nature exhibits a design, a plan, an order, a purpose. And what Christians are saying is that when we live in harmony with that purpose, we will be happier and healthier. So now that we've looked at the secular worldview in the big picture, with its low view of the body, let's see how it works out in detail, starting with abortion. Today, professional bioethicists agree that life begins at conception, that the fetus is biologically human. The evidence from science, from genetics and DNA, is just too strong to deny it. So how do they get around that fact to support abortion? They argue that merely being human is not enough to qualify for legal protection. The fetus has to earn the right to life by becoming a person, usually defined in terms of some kind of mental abilities, a certain level of self-awareness, cognitive functioning, autonomy, self-determination. And this is actually called personhood theory. And what secular bioethicists are saying is that even though the fetus is biologically human, that is not enough for human rights. That the fetus can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be used for research and experiments. It can be tinkered with genetically. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, as Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste, which is how medical journals refer to the fetus. In other words, being human is no longer enough for human rights. What's the most obvious problem with personhood theory? Well, when it's separated from biology, no one can agree on how to define it. Most ordinary people would probably say the fetus becomes a person sometime before birth. But the famous scientist Crick and Watson of DNA fame said we should give every newborn 3 days of genetic testing. The idea being that some genetic defects don't show up until after birth, so parents should still have the right to kill the baby. Peter Singer is an ethics professor at Princeton University who says been talking too much today. Even 3 years of age is a gray area. After all, how much cognitive functioning does a toddler have? So the concept of personhood has become completely arbitrary. Every bioethicist draws the line at a different place, depending on their own private views and values. So what's happened is supporters of abortion have lost the argument on the scientific level, in the fact realm. So they've shifted to the non-scientific, non-empirical, subjective concept of personhood, which is in the value realm. So today, it is Christians who are pro-science. What about euthanasia? It's driven by the same personhood theory, just in reverse. As one bioethicist says, once a patient has lost the capacity to reason, they cannot be called a person any longer. They are a mere body only. And at that point, you can be unplugged, your treatment withheld, your food and water discontinued, your organs harvested. So once again, being human is no longer enough for human rights. I was once invited to speak on an NPR program in San Francisco. I thought that might be an interesting audience. And before the show, the producer asked me about my views on various topics, including abortion. He said most people consider abortion okay until the fetus becomes a person. And I said, that statement carries enormous philosophical baggage. The secular view is fragmented. It assumes that the body is not integral to the person and that it is expendable. The pro-life view is holistic. It says the body shares in the inherent value and dignity of the whole person. He didn't have an answer to that, so I kept talking. I said the secular view is exclusive. It says some people don't measure up. They don't make the cut. They don't qualify for the status of personhood. The pro-life view is inclusive. If you're a member of the human race, you're in. You count. You have the full dignity of a member of the moral community, as ethicists say, the people who we have a moral obligation to. A few days later, I got a call from the producers saying they had decided to cancel the show. That's why you never hear from people like us on NPR. What about sexuality? How does it express that same dualistic view of the person? The entire premise of the hookup culture is that sex can be purely physical, disassociated from the whole person. In my book, Love Thy Body, I include several poignant quotes from college students, like Alicia, who says, hookups are very scripted. You learn to turn everything off except your body. You make yourself emotionally invulnerable. A college student named Naomi told Rolling Stone magazine, the mistake people make is they assume there are two very distinct elements in a relationship, one emotional and one sexual, and they pretend like there are clean lines between them. She's almost verbally describing this dualistic view of the human person. Another Rolling Stone article quoted a young man named Curtis who said, sex is just a piece of body touching another piece of body. It is existentially meaningless. No wonder the hookup culture is creating a trail of wounded people. People are trying to live out a secular ethic that treats their most intimate relationships as meaningless. A college psychologist says the two most prescribed medications on the university campus today are birth control pills and antidepressants. And that's not a coincidence. The Christian ethic is incarnational. The most complete and intimate physical union is meant to express the most complete and intimate personal union in the whole life commitment of marriage. And again, science is on our side. Scientists were shocked when they discovered the interconnection between body and person with the discovery that sex releases bonding hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin. These are hormones that create a sense of attachment and trust. So a UCLA psychiatrist said, "You might say we were designed to bond." You don't expect that from a UCLA psychiatrist. Scripture teaches that human beings are embodied spirits, which comes out beautifully in the parallelism of Hebrew poetry. My soul thirsts for you, my flesh yearns for you. Our soul has sunk down into the dust, our body cleaves to the earth. Keep my words in the midst of your heart, for they are life to those who find them and health to all their body. So the inner life of the soul is expressed through the outer life of the body. So the Bible treats the human being as an integrated unity. So let's now move to more controversial territory. What about homosexuality? Here again, the secular ethic rests on a dualism that devalues the body. Think of it this way. Even my homosexual friends agree that on the level of biology, physiology, anatomy, chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That is how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. To embrace a same-sex identity, then, is implicitly to contradict that design. It's to say, why should the structure of my body inform my identity? Why should my biological sex, as male or female, have any say in my moral choices? We have to help people see that this is a profoundly disrespectful view of the body. It pits the mind against the body and says it's only the mind and feelings that count. So that we can use our two-story diagram again to show that disassociation. Some people will argue that sexual orientation is rooted in our genes, so it is rooted in our biology, but there's no conclusive evidence of a biological cause. In fact, the most recent research has found that about 80% of people who come out as homosexual change their sexual identity label at least once to heterosexual, bisexual, queer, and so on. 80% change their sexual identity label at least once. And this research is done by Lisa Diamond, who herself identifies as a lesbian. This does not sound like a trait that is biologically determined. A magazine called The New Scientist says it's time to get past born this way. Now, in religious circles, we sometimes hear people say, well, God made me gay, right? You've heard that. But I met a former homosexual who's now married to a woman, you have to say that these days, and has 3 children. And he said, if God makes people gay, wouldn't that make him a cruel God? Because he's engineered their minds and emotions for attraction to the same sex, but he's created the physiology to be in direct opposition to that attraction. Would God create people to be torn in 2 conflicting directions? Not the Christian God. Things like conflict, self-division, self-alienation, self-estrangement are results of the fall, not creation. In my book, I tell a lot of personal stories. Now that I teach, I got a lot of stories from my students, which is fun. So don't think of it as just a book on moral philosophy. There's lots and lots of anecdotes. And one of my favorite is the story of Sean. His name was Sean Doherty. And as a young man, he was exclusively attracted to other men. Today, he is married to a woman and has 3 children. And what's interesting about his story is that he grew up in a gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church. So he didn't think there was anything wrong with same-sex attraction. You know, gay activists say, well, if somebody changes, they were driven by guilt, shame, and self-loathing. But Sean had no sense of guilt, so why did he change? Sean says, I realized that as a man, God's original intention for me in creation was to be able to relate sexually to a woman. And this remained true, quite irrespective of whatever feelings I might have. So he did not try to change his feelings directly, which rarely works. But he says, my goal instead was to acknowledge what I already had, which was a male body, as a good gift from God. And eventually my feelings started to follow suit. And that is really the core of this debate. Do we live in a cosmos operating by blind material causes, or do we live in a cosmos designed by a loving creator, which is therefore intrinsically good, a good gift from God? What about transgender ideology? Well, here the devaluing of the body is especially easy to see. Transgender activists argue explicitly that your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological sex. Jessica Savano is a male-to-female transsexual who created a Kickstarter page for a documentary titled, I Am Not My Body. That title says it all, right? That my body is not part of my authentic self. The Washington Post quoted a curriculum for first graders where teachers were, I just did it again, where teachers were taught to say, to tell first graders, you might feel like you're a boy, even if you have body parts that some people might tell you are girl parts. Note, what some people might tell you, and of course, likewise for girls. My students were all raised on Blue's Clues, so they all get outraged at this example. During Gay Pride Month, the show essentially told young children the biology gives no clues to your identity. It's even reaching down to newborns with gender-neutral parenting. There's a Facebook page for these families, and it says, there is no such thing as biological sex. Point blank. Sure, people have bodies, chromosomes, and genitals, but calling this sex is a social construction rather than a biological fact. This is serious biology denial. And so we can use our diagram, once again, to show that disassociation. And what should our response be as Christians? We should ask, why accept such an extreme devaluation of the body? Today, Christians have a wonderful opportunity to show that a biblical ethic rests on a positive view of how God made us as physically embodied beings. The biological correspondence between male and female is not some evolutionary accident. It is part of the original creation that God pronounced very good. What's coming next after transgenderism? The next stage is transhumanism. The idea that we will bioengineer our bodies to create the next stage of evolution. A professor emeritus of Princeton University puts it this way: since nature has no telos, no teleology, no inbuilt purpose, the human species is at its greatest when it breaks out of nature, when it breaks free from our human identity. The underlying worldview is that the body is not integral to the self, but merely the raw material out of which we create something radically novel, even transcendent to humanity. Here's Google's director of engineering. By the way, these are not fringe people. This is Google's director of engineering. The whole idea of a human species is a biological concept. What we're doing is transcending biology. Some transhumanists predict that we will download our brains to computers and enjoy digital immortality. The creator of Sirius XM Radio is a man who identifies as a woman and who writes, "Humanness is in the mind, which means a human need not have a flesh body, but can do just as well on a computer disk." And he says there is a clear line of development from transgender to transhumanism. And he urges us to overcome what he calls the sin of fleshism, the title of the slide. The sin of fleshism, by which he means an immoral preference for a body of flesh, just like it's immoral to hold racism or sexism. Fleshism is now the new sin. We might label this scientific Gnosticism because it shares some traits with the ancient Gnosticism that the early church faced. The ancient version denigrated the body as the prison of the soul and defined salvation as escape from that prison. And today's scientific Gnosticism promises that advanced scientific knowledge and technology will liberate us from the constraints of the body. So let's get practical. How does understanding the secular worldview help us make sense of politics? A basic principle of politics is that a free society is possible only if it recognizes that some rights are pre-political. That means the state does not create them, it merely recognizes them as pre-existing. You know, what the state creates, the state can take away. And so you do not have inalienable rights unless you acknowledge that some rights are not created by the state. So many of our pre-political rights are actually rooted in biology. So if the law does not acknowledge biology, we lose those rights. Take abortion. The right to life is the most fundamental right of all. It's the right not to be killed. The state did not create that right. It's a right you have just because you're a member of the human race. But the only way the state could legalize abortion was to rule that some humans, namely those in the womb, are not legal persons who warrant protection, which means that the state has claimed the authority to decide which humans qualify as persons with a right to life, not based on biology, but its own arbitrary fiat. Marriage is a pre-political right. It's based on the fact that men and women naturally come together to form families. The state can regulate marriage, but it did not create marriage. But the only way the state could treat same-sex couples the same as opposite-sex couples was to deny the biological component of marriage and to redefine it as a purely emotional commitment. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court did in its Obergefell decision when it legalized same-sex marriage. But we have lots of emotional commitments. So how do we decide which ones qualify as marriage? The state has claimed the authority to define which of them constitute a marriage, based not on the facts of biology, but purely on its own say-so. Parenthood. Up until now, who counts as the child's legal parents was based on biological relationship. The woman who gives birth is the mother, and her legal husband was presumed to be the child's biological father. This is called the presumption of parentage. But in same-sex couples, at least one partner is not biologically related to the child. Until recently, that person's name did not go on the birth certificate. They could adopt, of course, but same-sex parents wanted to be treated exactly like opposite-sex parents. Anything else they said would be discrimination. And in 2017, the Supreme Court agreed. If a same-sex couple is legally married, the non-biological spouse is given the presumption of parentage, which means the state has claimed the authority to redefine parentage without regard to biology. In principle, parenthood is now treated as something created by the state. You are your child's parent if the state says you are, in principle. Finally, until recently, gender identity followed naturally, organically from your biological sex. Most people didn't think there was a difference. But the only way the law can treat a transgender woman, meaning someone born male, the same as a biological woman, was to treat biology as irrelevant. And in its Bostock decision, the Supreme Court ruled that sex in Title VII really means gender. So the law no longer sees you as a man or a woman. It recognizes only what gender identity you claim. And of course, President Trump, I'm sure you're all following, has signed four executive orders dealing with different transgender issues. But for now, Bostock still stands. So what's the principle in all of these cases? Many pre-political rights are rooted in biology, and when the law no longer recognizes biology, the state claims the authority to redefine those rights. So the sexual revolution is dramatically increasing the power of the state. So let's end with a practical note. What do we do if somebody in our family or church or school identifies as gay or trans? In Love Thy Body, I tell the story of a young woman named Jean who lived as a lesbian for several years, is now married to a man, and has 2 children. What was the turning point for Jean? She says, I finally came to trust that God had made me female for a reason, and I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. So the first strategy is use positive language. Did you catch that? Honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. Respect your biological identity. Live in tune with your body. Live in harmony with the Creator's design. Let's face it, Christians are generally known for giving a negative message. Right? It's wrong, it's a sin, it's against the Bible, don't do it. And that's true. But if you lead with that message, it creates the mistaken notion that Christianity sees people as inherently evil, wicked, and corrupt. We should start where the Bible starts, with the message of creation. The sequence is creation, fall, redemption. Because we are the handiwork of God, we have inherent value and dignity. Even Christians sometimes hold a sacred secular split that devalues this world. One of my students put it this way: growing up in the church, I was always taught spirit good, body bad, which is a pretty good summary. But C.S. Lewis once said, there's no good trying to be more spiritual than God. God never meant man to be a purely spiritual creator. He likes matter. He invented it. The Christian ethic is based on a high view of the body. Shoot, I don't know why that's happening. We affirm that the Word became flesh, that God himself entered into human history and took on a physical body. The incarnation is the ultimate affirmation of the dignity of the human body. And what's going to happen at the end of time? Many Christians think we're going to be disembodied spirits floating around in heaven. But what does God say? God will create a new heaven and a new earth. From the beginning, the Apostles' Creed has affirmed the resurrection of the body. This is an astonishingly high view of the physical world. There's nothing like it in any other philosophy or religion. I will end with a story. Some of you may know her by now. She's written a book. But her name is Laura Perry. Some of you know Laura? I got her story long before she wrote her book, but she had transitioned to a male identity and successfully passed as a man for 10 years. And then she converted to Christianity. And at first she thought she could continue living as a man. She said, I aspired to be a real man of God. But one day while she was praying, she seemed to hear God say to her, you cannot claim to love me and yet reject my creation. And she knew what that meant. She cannot reject her body, her biological identity. And today she is living as the woman that God made her to be. So what's the answer to the secular worldview? To build a Christian culture that loves God and loves his creation. The good news is not just salvation. The good news is also creation. That God created you, both soul and body, and that he calls you to love your body. Thank you very much. I'll ask the first question. there's a part of the talk that I cut out for time limit, and I always get asked this question. I'm always asked, what about intersex? And that was a big deal with the Olympics this year, right? And so I always, generally, I keep that in there no matter what. Because many people wonder, what is intersex? Is it transgender? Is it the same thing? It's not the same thing. Transgender people have perfectly normal physical features. Genes, genitals, gonads, all align. Intersex people have an actual physical condition. That their anatomy or their hormones are atypical or anomalous because of a problem with their hormones or their genes. And many secular people like to use intersex people to argue that sex is a spectrum. Right? You've got male and female, and you've got all these intersex people in between. First of all, that's mathematically impossible because they're like 0.2% of the population, so they don't form a spectrum. But more importantly, scientifically, there are only two gametes. There's sperm and egg. There is not a spectrum in between. When I was writing Love Thy Body, I was contacted by an intersex woman who is a Christian. Somehow she heard I was writing this book, and so she gave me her perspective, especially on the use of intersex people for political reasons, and she said this. She says, how do you think it feels to be a pawn in someone else's game? It hurts to be treated as a political football by either side. And she says either side because a lot of Christians don't understand intersex either. The first church she went to when she converted to Christianity, they said, well, you're transgender. She said, no, intersex. They didn't know what it meant. So as Christians, we should educate ourselves on what intersex means because it's just a physical difference like other disabilities, and these people should be welcomed and accepted like anyone else with some physical disability. So as Christians, it's important for us to understand the difference. And the Olympics brought it to our attention. So that's my first question. That gave you time to think about yours. Was I really so comprehensive? Oh, Lily.
Thank you so much for your talk. One common question I'm asked is the debate on pronoun hospitality. I know that there are both sides to it, but could you share with us your perspective and why?
Yeah, so in Christian audiences, I often get the question, but shouldn't we use people's pronouns because that's compassionate? And what I say is, what about compassion to the people that you're causing to violate their own conscience? To violate their own sense of integrity by saying something they think is false. Essentially, you are asking someone to say something that they believe is false, to call a woman a man, call a man a woman. And I hope you realize that this is the first step that totalitarian regimes always use. Get people to mouth the regime's propaganda even if they don't believe it, because they know that if you mouth something, if you're forced to express something that you yourself do not believe, it breaks you down internally, breaks down your sense of integrity. And I had the opportunity recently to talk to somebody from Eastern Europe. I was with the ADF. Where's our ADF guy? I was speaking in Vienna to ADF International, and so there was a lawyer there who was from East Germany. And he said that's what it was like growing up under communist East Germany, that we were forced to comply with things that we disagreed with. We were forced to go along with policies that we disagreed with. And here's how he put it. When you're forced to comply, forced to acquiesce in something that you think is false, he said, you learn to hate yourself. Isn't that interesting? You learn to hate yourself because you feel like you're caving in to falsehood. So what I say to Christian audiences when they say, well, shouldn't we be compassionate? I say, be compassionate to the people whose sense of integrity you are tearing down. Nobody thinks about them. So that's my answer. And I thought it was so cool to talk to somebody from a communist country who said, yep, that's exactly what it's like.
I'm thinking about teachers with preschool kids and second graders and fifth graders and 10th graders and seniors and on through. How can teachers be supportive of students' sexual development? You don't have to go through every grade necessarily, But in terms of cognitive and psychological development, what's appropriate and valuable for a teacher to do in the context of a classroom in a Christian school setting?
Well, another thing that I cut for space, for time limit, usually in this talk I give one sort of longer anecdote of a boy who suffered from severe gender dysphoria from a very young age. Back when we used to call it transsexualism, it was almost always male, and it usually started quite young. So this was sort of a classic case. And he was very close to me, so I know his story intimately. Before he was even walking, his babysitter said, "He's too good to be a boy," by which she meant he's gentle, compliant, quiet, the things we associate with girls. When he was in preschool and his mother picked him up, invariably he was playing with the little girls, not the boys. By elementary school, he was coming to his parents weeping and saying, I don't fit in with the guys, but the girls don't really accept me either because I'm a guy. I don't fit in anywhere, and here's how he put it. I'm interested in the things girls are. I like the things girls. I think like a girl. God should have made me a girl. By early teens, he was scouring the internet for information on sex reassignment surgery. So what did his parents do? First of all, they made sure he knew they loved him just the way he was. In seminary, I went to Covenant. I've met some Covenant people. I went to Covenant Seminary, and a friend of mine was a former homosexual. And he said, I like music and art, and my dad was baffled, kept trying to toughen me up by pushing me into more masculine things like sports. I forgot to tell you my little boy's story. His name, I call him Brandon. Brandon's parents did not do that. They did not pressure him to be different. They said it's perfectly okay to be a sensitive, emotional, relational boy. It does not mean you're really a girl. They said it could be that God has gifted you for one of the caring professions, like psychologist, counselor, healthcare worker. They took him even through the Myers-Briggs test and said, look, you can be at either end of the spectrum. And in the same way, a girl can be gender nonconforming by being more outgoing, assertive, rational, interested in the STEM subjects. They took him through the gifts of the Spirit. The gifts of the Spirit are not divided by sex. The fruit of the Spirit is not divided by sex. You don't have a little pink box and a little blue box. By the way, it took him a long time. Apparently 80 to 85% of kids outgrow it during puberty, during the rush of hormones. This was a pretty severe case. He did not outgrow it until mid-20s. And at that time, the way he put it to me, he said, I realized surgery would not give me what I want. It would not make me a girl. And he said, a person is not a computer disk that you can erase and start over again. I liked his analogy. But there was a famous TED Talk by a cardiologist. It's called His and Her Healthcare, and her name is Paula Johnson. And the most famous line from the TED Talk is, every cell has a sex. And obviously you cannot change every cell in your body. So scientifically, it is impossible to change your sex. And by the way, Brandon never did transition. He didn't transition, but he's still kind of he's just an outlier in terms of personality. He tends to be, even today as a young adult, just more of a gentle, soft-spoken, sweet-natured boy. So that's my way of kind of explaining what we should do with our kids, is tell them God made them with these gifts. God has a purpose for the way he made them. We love him just the way he is, and it's okay to be gender nonconforming. You don't have to fit the John Wayne masculinity stereotype, and girls don't have to be frilly and fancy. It's okay. And I think, do you know what Brandon told me? He said the hardest places are Christian circles, because Christians are so concerned to stand against the secular culture that we almost overdo the sex stereotypes. And so that's what we, as in our churches and schools and universities, we should be aware of that. I think we should reach out, actually, to the non-gender conforming kids, because these days they are targeted, especially in public schools. They are targeted. A niece of mine was homeschooled until age 12 and then went to public school, and her classmate said, "You're gay." She said, no, I'm not. Apparently, she's a little bit more masculine in their view. Yes, you are. You're gay. Well, she didn't come from a Christian family, so she decided she was. She's now a lesbian. But the point is, they get targeted. They get targeted by the curriculum. Do you remember the Washington Post curriculum for first graders? But they get targeted by their peers if they don't fit the stereotypes. So I think as Christians, we should actually proactively minister to the kids who are gender nonconforming because they are feeling a lot of pressure. Oh, hi.
Hi. What you just said is a perfect foundation for my question. Does gender exist? And I'm saying it that way deliberately. When I say gender, I mean something that's distinct from sex. You just talked about gender nonconforming. You talked about masculinity and femininity. There are stereotypes, and boys and girls comport with those stereotypes, fulfill those stereotypes to varying degrees. But is there an actual reality from a Christian perspective that you could say exists that corresponds to the word gender?
Well, obviously, we could start with the biological differences between men and women. That's sort of the baseline, right? Men are bigger, stronger, faster. Because of testosterone, they tend to be more aggressive and more risk-taking. Women's superpower is bearing children, and we need to treat that as a superpower. Because one reason we have feminism is that as soon as you acknowledge a difference, people think one is better than. And so when we say men are stronger, we think of women as weaker. But taking care of a newborn is incredibly difficult. You have to develop personality traits like you have to be willing to be interrupted 24 hours a day, no matter what you're doing. You have to be incredibly sensitive to nonverbal cues, because they don't speak yet. You have to be very sensitive to danger in the environment, right? Because this baby is so vulnerable. You have to be a mama bear. And so we need to talk about both masculine and feminine traits as strengths. Now, I do think, to some degree, we have psychological traits that go along with those strengths. That men are, when we say they're more aggressive and risk-taking, that's not just physically. I think that's emotionally, in terms of personality traits. And I do think that just statistically, women tend to be more nurturing, maybe the experience of childbirth, but they do end up being, to some degree, more nurturing, more sensitive. They test out higher on tests of emotional intelligence. But I think a lot of that is because of childbearing, raising kids. But they do test out higher on emotional intelligence. So if you think of gender in a more limited thing of, well, of course, male and female have different psychological traits, I think we can acknowledge that. Now, there's also cultural conventions. In some cultures, women wear black veils from head to toe, and in some cultures, they wear grass skirts. I don't know if they still do, but in New Guinea, they used to wear grass skirts. So a lot of what people call gender are these cultural differences, which I probably wouldn't call gender. I would just say different cultures have different ways of dressing and eating and different behavioral norms. I wouldn't call that gender, but it's often included under the term gender. So I would say, and then of course, then there's the transgender ideology, which I disagree with, which is there's this internal, mysterious identity that has nothing to do with your biology. The ghost in the machine, all the way back to Descartes. This ghost in the machine has a unique gender, and I disagree with that because that's the gender ideology has taken it to the point where this is a mysterious inner self that's not knowable, that's not tied to any data, any scientific facts. It's it's not something you can even talk about. It's this internal sense of who I am. I don't even know how you have an internal sense of being the opposite sex. I don't think that even makes sense. So I would disagree with the gender ideology use, the transgender ideology use of the term gender. I think as Christians we can acknowledge that there are different personality traits, and your personality traits are separate from your sex. So in that sense, we could use the word gender in that way. Anybody else? These have been good questions. Hi, Bob.
So you deal with this more frequently than I do. You've researched it more deeply. One thought that I've had is there's a condition, psychological condition called boanthropy, where a human being thinks that he or she is a cow.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course, we don't affirm people that are suffering from boanthropy. And of course you're a cow. We'll put you out in the barn. We'll give you feed, and we'll send you to the vet rather than the pediatrician. Have you discussed that sort of thing with why biology is determinative over our psychology or our self-perception? And if so, what do transgender advocates, how do they respond to those types of questions? Or an eating disorder might be another perceptual sort of issue. That what is the response from the activist on that point? Those kinds of points.
First of all, ironically, some transgender activists say biological sex is a hate term. Biological sex is a hate term. In other words, it's been used against them so often that now that is a hate term, and you're not allowed to use it anymore. By the way, I had a student who used to be a furry. He used to think he was, I don't remember what animal he was, but he was a furry. And some people have thought that I overemphasize biology in my book. And because of what you're just saying, we should take our identity from our biology and not have some sort of inner sense of either gender or, there's another word for people who think there's an animal. There's furries. At any rate, I come back to biology again and again in my book, and I've had a few critics say, well, aren't you overemphasizing biology? And I'm like, wait, Martin Luther said, if you're fighting the battle all around, but you're not fighting where the enemy's attacking, you're not really fighting the battle. And biology, the value of the body is what's being attacked. See, a lot of Christians don't recognize that because we have the sacred-secular split. And so many of us have been raised with the notion that this life doesn't really matter. All that matters is the spiritual world. Like my student who said, spirit good, body bad. So because of the sacred secular split, I think a lot of Christians have not recognized what the secular ideology is saying. The way it devalues the body, the way it says your body's not part of your authentic self, the way that they say your gender can be totally free-floating apart from your biological identity. We haven't recognized it because we have somewhat of a history of denigrating the body, the physical world. So what I say to people when they say, well, aren't you overemphasizing biology? I say, actually, that's the point of where the secular world is attacking right now. And it's not that I think the body is the most important thing, or biology is the most important. I don't think that's the most important part of life. It just happens to be where the battle is. And so we better, get to that part of the battle and fight. So I come back again and again to where do you get your identity? If your mind and your body are in conflict, who wins? Which one do you go with? And that's kind of how you have to talk to young people. When they finally have to make some kind of decision, your mind is in contradiction to your body. Which one is the real you? What do you go with? And what I say to them is, look, your feelings can change, and they often do. But your body is an empirical fact that doesn't change, so it just makes sense to go with your body. It's rational to take your identity from your body. Thank you.